My name is Joe Nagy and I have the privilege of chairing this meeting. The topic today, as most of you know, is Dirty Secrets, our ASIO files. Dr. Meredith Burgmann will now begin the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I want to talk to you today, surprise, surprise, I'm an author, this is what we do. I'd like to talk to you about the book Dirty Secrets, our ASIO files, and about some of the amazing things that I discovered when we were putting together this book. I knew I had an ASIO file because when Bob Carr closed down the increasingly incompetent and corrupt special branch, which is basically the state branch of ASIO in New South Wales. He closed it down in 1996 and we were allowed to apply for our files then. And I applied for mine and I discovered that the special branch was still following me in 1996. I had been a Member of Parliament for 5 years, totally mainstream Labor Party Member of Parliament, and they were still following me. They were reporting on things like the fact that I had asked for people to sign a petition about killings in Mexico. I had had a press conference down in the press gallery in Parliament House. What bored cameraman or bored journalist had reported back to ASIO? There was an informant in the room, in the press gallery room at Parliament House. You'd really wonder about these things. Anyway, I discovered I had a special branch file, and so I then knew I also had an ASIO file. But there is a 30-year rule for ASIO files, so you can't apply until 30 years is up. But that has now been changed to a 20-year rule, and it's slowly changing to the 20-year rule. So now your ASIO file is available up to about 1986. Anyway, so I knew I had an ASIO file, and when it arrived, it was a big, thick file about that high, all wrapped up in brown paper, beautifully wrapped. And I found myself unable to open it. There was something stopping me looking at my file, and I discovered from a whole lot of other people I talked to that they had the same reluctance. In fact, Anne Curthoys, who a lot of you will know, a very distinguished left-wing professor, she in the end said to me she had agreed to write a chapter for the book, and then she said she couldn't because she knew she couldn't look at her file. And I've wondered what this reluctance was about. My little sister refused to look at her file too. And she was quite open about it. She said, I don't want to find out who was informing on me. I eventually got her to look at it, but that comes a bit later. So there was this reluctance about finding out about the background. When I decided to do the book, New South Publishing had come to me and said, would you do a book where people look at their ASIO files and then write about them? And I sort of reluctantly agreed, and then I thought, well, I might as well get sort of well-known people well-known within their own profession, or, you know, famous people like David Stratton, Michael Kirby, Philip Adams, Anne Summers, Peter Cundall, the gardener, all have ASIO files. So I asked them to write about their files, and it's this really, I think it's a really interesting book. And to my surprise, the book ended up being something more than I had intended it to be. There's 27 contributions in there, 27 chapters from different people, from all, you know, academics and activists, actors. That the thing that surprised me was that when I read the final draft, I thought, this isn't just a book about ASIO. This is also a book about the social and political movements of the 60s and 70s. It was a cultural history of and political history of that period. I was also worried that there'd be a sense of sameness about the chapters, that they'd all basically be white male students with beards writing about the Communist Party. But it wasn't. I got 10 women in the book, which I was very pleased about. They're Aboriginal activists, gay rights activists. I've got Dennis Altman and Lex Watson, who've both written chapters. There's a wonderful chapter from Joan Bielski, who a lot of you will know as a sort of an old blue stocking educationist, but in the 1950s she was a prim young English teacher who went to Canberra and she was teaching English as a foreign language, and it just happened that one of her students was Vladimir Petrov, and ASIO broke into her apartment, looked through her library, discovered there was some Russian books there that obviously Vladimir had given her, and she was followed from then on. It's that easy to trigger a fire. There are people from all different political persuasions. We have Trotskyists, Maoists, communists, women's libbers, gay activists, Aboriginal activists, anarchists. They're all there in the book. And it's really interesting that they all say exactly the same thing in the end, which is, why was ASIO following me? Why was all that money wasted on me? And when you actually read the chapters, you do recognise a lot of what I would call make work. It's ASIO piling fact upon fact and putting in a whole lot of information which is absolutely irrelevant and not at all useful. In fact, there's been 2 commissions of inquiry into ASIO, both by Justice Robert Hope, and in one of those inquiries he says, I hope ASIO gets around to filing this, and he keeps making references to the fact that they need to file their information. And what he was meaning is, this is a lot of irrelevant information because there is so much pointless statements, like, at one stage they say that my car was parked outside 26 Dargan Street, Glebe at 5:45am in the morning. It was where I lived. Another time they talk about me walking down Oxford Street and then going with Russell Herman and Caroline Wheat and then turning into a bottle shop. Yeah, that's really important information. I mean, it really is just make work activity. We have a chapter in there right at the beginning by David McKnight, who's really the academic expert on ASIO, and it's called How to Read Your ASIO File. And he goes into what all the notations on your file means, what the initials mean, what the annotations mean, and also a bit of the history of ASIO at that time. Now, everyone asks me, having produced this book, is that ASIO necessary and are they effective? Now, my answer to that is, look, if a society believes it needs some sort of intelligence organisation, a secret intelligence organisation, then one would hope that that organisation or agency is well resourced, well run. They hire the cleverest, best trained operatives, and that what they gather is useful and good information. That's what you hope. And I believe that Australia probably has decided they need some sort of intelligence organisation, simply because no one's really arguing ASIO go home now. we're sort of all half hoping that they'll stop the bomb being put on our plane or whatever. However, the other question, which are they effective, is harder to answer, because really the only evidence we have is the evidence of 30 years ago, when we can see what they were gathering on us as citizens, and I can tell you it's not very reassuring. At the beginning, they were asked to report on subversion, and they obviously had no idea what subversion was. Well, what is subversion? It is such a broad and general term. Later on, it was changed to they needed to report on politically motivated violence, which I think is a much better aim for an intelligence organisation. But they didn't seem to be much clearer about what politically motivated violence was either. At one stage in Anne Summers' file, you know Anne Summers, the wonderful feminist writer, and they were following her around, and they wrote, "Capacity for violence, nil." And Anne was horrified by this. Can I say, not as horrified by something else they wrote in her file. She rang me at 11:20 one night saying, "Meredith, I've just read my file," and they said, "Anne Summers is fashionably but not well dressed." Anyway, they did say this about Anne, that her capacity for violence was nil, which is one of the few bits of analysis you actually see in anyone's ASIO file. Now, after they made that deduction, they should have closed the file and moved on to someone else, but they didn't. They followed her for another 15 years, or maybe longer. We just don't know, because, you know, of the 30-year rule. They were still following her after they worked out she wasn't a threat to anyone. And they also make really basic mistakes. They get Peter Murphy confused with another Peter Murphy. Easy, it's a very common name. They thought that Anne Summers was actually a psychiatrist called Dr. Anne Cooper, which Anne Cooper was Anne Summers' maiden name. Tim Anderson, they confused with a man called Glenn Anderson. There are so many just really basic mistakes that happen. Mark Aarons' girlfriends, they're always a year behind. And as Mark said, why didn't they just ring us up and ask? You know, we could have got them straight on the girlfriends. Even when they do the redactions, now the redactions are when you apply for your file, that nowadays you do it through the National Archives. When I applied, you did it direct to ASIO. And ASIO find your file, they then do redactions, you know, they put a black texter through it, and that is they say it is to protect sort of ongoing stuff and to protect the identity of informants. And they even did that so badly that when I got my file and looked through it, I immediately could work out who the informant was in an organisation I was involved with called the Southern Africa Liberation Centre. It was just obvious. You know, there were small meetings of about 6 or 7 people, and there was an informant in there. So you could tell from the minutes, you know, just by doing a sort of a whip through and work out who's always there when there's a report, and it was quite clear who the informant was. So even when they're trying to protect their own, they're incompetent. They don't analyse anything. I imagine they'd say something like Christian do-gooder doesn't know what she's doing, bit of a deal, something, you know, anything, something like that I would have gone, oh yeah, you know, not true, but there's nothing. They just compile the information. The only time I've seen something approaching analysis was when, in my file, they talk about my dear friend Gary Foley, the Aboriginal activist, and they say, Gary Foley appears to be in Black Power and is a pest. Alan Hardy, who is the son of Frank Hardy, and he wrote a lovely chapter about his father. It's quite a touching chapter actually, because he realises by reading his father's ASIO file, he discovers a lot about his own father and the fact that his father was always in debt, that he had a drinking problem, you know. And so it's a very interesting chapter. But when he looks at his own file, the file says, Alan Hardy is thin and tidy, lives with another male in King's Cross, and is very interested in theatrics. And as Alan says, is this code for obviously gay? And had him totally confused with a burly truck driver also called Alan Hardy. So they really weren't very accurate about what they were doing. There was also some extraordinary stuff in there which gave you a bit of an idea how they were thinking. And David, when he talks, is going to talk about some of the more extraordinary stuff that happened during the Cold War. But just in this book alone, we have David Stratton. Now, why was ASIO following David Stratton? They were really worried about the fact that he had worn a red tie and handkerchief to Polish National Day. And even at the time, David admits that he was voting Liberal, and they still had a file on him. But what I did discover, though, looking at his file, was that every single person on the board of the Sydney Film Festival had an ASIO file. And I soon worked out what are the things that trigger an ASIO file. First of all, if you get arrested, mostly triggers a file, but not always. If you are in the Communist Party or one of the Trotskyist groupings, or certainly the Maoists, triggers a file. Thirdly, and this is obviously what triggered David's file, was if you have any sort of relation with Eastern Europe. And what the film festival, of course, was doing was trying to get Czech film directors and Hungarian films and everything into Australia. There are two other categories which are a bit more complex, but if you're working in a scientific area and had left leanings, you were toast. And if you were in communications, they were very worried about Cole Cooper, who at the age of 15 was being followed around because he was a telegram messenger boy and he was in the Eureka Youth League, and they thought he was using his obvious expertise in communications to no doubt bring down the Western world. But they actually move him from a job in the Overseas Telephone Exchange to a job in an ordinary telephone exchange because they didn't want him intercepting really important messages from important people overseas. Although, as Cole says, the only really interesting conversation he ever sat in on was the one between, was it Cary Grant and Ava Gardner, who came here to do On the Beach? Was it Cary Grant? Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner. He heard them talking to each other. But the sort of make work fact upon fact thing is really obvious in, say, Peter Cundall's file. You know, do you know what they had in his file? They had copies of a little Ronioed newsletter he used to produce called Apple Juice, which was about when to pop your petunias and when to strike your cuttings and things like that. But they had, it's all in his ASIO file. Now, my little sister Verity, she was in a Trotskyist group, and she writes about that some amusement. But I particularly wanted her in the book because I was so fascinated by her photo file. There were 10 photos of her in her ASIO photo file. All 10 of them were of her standing on a beach in a bikini. It's quite extraordinary when you think, what earthly use is this to our intelligence service? There's a bit of evidence in the files that ASIO was being improper, in that they were doing the bidding of the Conservative government of the time, and really an intelligence organisation should be collecting evidence on a non-partisan basis, non-party political basis, but they weren't to them subversion meant anything that is in opposition to the government of the time. They were very interested in the anti-apartheid movement. Now, how is that anything to do with subversion, you know, opposing racial discrimination in another country? But they were very interested in that. But also, you can tell from Jean McLean's chapter that they were taping Jim Cairns' telephone, later Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. They were tapping his phone. Although when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, they're probably tapping Anthony Albanese's phone too. And he was Deputy Prime Minister last year, but, you know, who knows? One of the things that really appalled me was, you remember the Frank Hardy criminal libel case where, when he produced Power Without Glory, he was charged with criminal libel, which is different to ordinary libel, where it's a civil action. Criminal libel is when the police charge you and say this is a libel which is so great that you should go to jail. So Frank was really on trial for his, you know, for his freedom. And it was a very famous trial, and eventually the jury, there's a jury in a criminal libel trial, they found him not guilty, and the head of ASIO, Brigadier General Spry, actually calls for a file on each of the jurors, which is extraordinary. This was a jury trial. And there's also in my file, there's evidence that they were, during the anti-Springbok campaign, they were feeding information to the Prime Minister's department about stuff I was doing in the anti-Springbok campaign. Just to finish off with, Michael Kirby gets his first mention when he's 12, and then later they say, they quote his auntie who says that she thinks Michael Kirby is brainy but reactionary, and Michael says that's absolutely accurate. You might think 12's bad, but I came across a file, in Lucy Woodcock's file, there's reference to a little boy who's the daughter of a friend of hers, the son of a friend of hers, and he's reported on when he's 4.5. They actually report Jonathan Reid, and if any of you know Jonathan Reid, I'd love to meet him. He'd be about our age. Jonathan Reid organises meetings away from teachers' grasp, is an active propagandist. He was 4.5. Both Jean McLean and Col Cooper were sacked or moved from their jobs. Anne Summers was, they said that if she took a public service job, it had to be in a non-controversial area. Penny Lockwood discovered that the man that she'd been having a relationship with for a year was an ASIO plant, and eventually he couldn't do it anymore and he admits it to her. That's in her chapter. As I say, I discovered they were still following me when I was an MP. But the thing in my file that distressed me the most was they stole my address book, and because they didn't have photocopying machines, so they typed out every single name in my address book for May 1970. And it's rather interesting because you can find out who your friends were in May 1970. And but it also, that's how I knew that Michael Kirby had a file, because what they'd done was, beside each name that they typed out, they'd then put the file number, the ASIO file number. So I realised that about 3/4 of my friends and acquaintances at the time had an ASIO file. Jeff Robertson didn't, by the way. But one of my friends was a totally apolitical family friend who was in the Navy, and they were very concerned about able seaman John Bloggs, I won't say his name, and they were worried because he was actually a cryptographer at HMAS Cuttable, the stationary naval station in Sydney. And the next 20 pages in my file is all about, you know, Abel Seaman, John Bloggs, and they eventually take him out of the cryptography room and send him off to PNG, and he's never allowed to do cryptography again. And he was a maths nerd, and that's what he wanted to do. He was a brilliant cryptographer, and he never did it again. And I sometimes think I probably inadvertently ruined his life, because he was never particularly happy in the Navy after that. And I've never actually said to him, I've never actually told him that I think it was probably my fault that this happened to him. Finally, there's a bit of a discussion going on now about whether ASIO files should be destroyed. My view, originally I thought, oh yes, maybe they should be destroyed, but I've realised since that they are invaluable. They are, especially the special branch files, because they're very detailed and very, like, you get a page of your special branch file will cover probably about 3 or 4 months of your life, and each heading is some demo or meeting you've been at, and it's a wonderful jogging when you're writing. So I'm in the middle of doing a photo, being involved with a photo exhibition for the anti-apartheid movement, and whenever we have an argument about a date for something, I go and look it up in my ASIO file. So I now believe that they're very important historical documents and we should keep them. Thank you very much.